What's up guys, Mitch from the DIYRecordingStudio.com, and today we're going to be talking about some of the issues I found with a recent video by AP Mastering. Now, just a huge caveat to begin this video, I actually really like the content that he is creating. I think debunking audio myths is a really important thing for our industry. There are a lot of myths and misconceptions about how audio works, how plugins work, how hardware works, and what really goes on when we use these tools in our job. And in his recent video with Ethan Weiner, they covered a broad range of myths and misconceptions about audio, particularly to do with plugins. And for the most part, I agree with a lot of the things that they had to say. But there are some core issues with some of the things they had to say in regards to hardware.
Personally, I don't do that when recording. I want to record as clean as possible, and I'll add my dirt and grit and glue later when I can hear everything in context. People say you should commit. I don't see an advantage to committing. I honestly don't. All that does is takes away the option to change something later.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's my approach as well, to record clean and then do the distortion stuff after.
Now in this video, I'm going to give you a few reasons on why you should use hardware during the tracking phase as opposed to tracking clean. So both the guys mentioned that they prefer to track clean and use clean preamps with no processing and then do everything later on during mixing. And this is a huge problem to me because that is just really getting back to the way of doing things, like fixing things in the mix and relying on plugins to do all the heavy lifting. And I get it, it can be challenging sometimes to use things like EQ and compression during the tracking phase because no one wants to make a mistake during tracking. But I guarantee you, if you try using hardware, you'll be surprised with the results. And I'm going to preface this with, when I'm using hardware, I am typically tracking rock, pop, R&B, hip hop, and modern styles of music production. If you're tracking things like orchestral music or certain styles of jazz or genres like this, you probably do want to track as clean as possible. However, I really strongly disagree that you should track clean if you have a bunch of cool outboard gear. And I'm going to give you the reasons why. The first reason why I think you should track with hardware and not track clean is that when you track through EQ and compression, as an artist, you hear in your headphones immediately something similar to what's going to be on the record. You've got that vocal compression coming through. You can hear the EQ and the compression that would otherwise be added later in mixing. And the benefit of this is that the artist can hear themselves, one, just better and fuller, and they've got a better representation of what their voice really is. But then second of all, if using the compression results in too much S's or brightening up the vocals adds too much S'ing, well then they're gonna respond to that by controlling their S's in tracking. The same goes for any kind of potential issues that you would find later down the line once you add plugins like compression and EQ to, say, a vocal tracking. The artist is going to hear immediately what's going on and they're going to respond to that. So you're going to actually get a better performance because they're hearing themselves clearer, but they're also hearing the potential issues in their performance, be it vocals or drums or guitars, as they're performing along. Now this has an added benefit for the artist because you get a better performance as they push into those compressors and those EQs. And that's an awesome thing for the artist to have because they'll sing more confidently and they'll respond better in the tracking phase. And I can't argue this enough. I've recorded for years clean, and then I started recording with outboard gear like compressors and EQs. Immediately, I was getting better performances from the artists that I work with. The other benefit of having real physical hardware on the input stage whilst tracking is that it all happens in zero latency. So you don't have any latency issues like you might with other plugins being on the insert and all that kind of stuff. You can just go for it. The artist hears themselves exactly how it's coming through the microphone into that hardware. And once again, you get that kind of push and pull between the artist and the equipment and their performance. Now, my next point kind of ties into this as well, where I think they're missing another point of tracking with hardware. Let's say you're a guitarist and you want an awesome distorted sound with some delays and some phase effects or whatever. Recording clean is the same as taking a guitarist and taking all those effects off and just running a DI signal. That's how I would liken it. If you record guitars completely clean through a DI and then add all those effects later on, which you can do, you're going to get a very different performance out of the artist as opposed to putting all those effects on during the tracking phase and then responding to that. If they play just to a DI sound, they're gonna perform differently. They'll probably play a bit softer because the transients will poke through more because there's no distortion added. They might play too soft, or they might not bite into the guitar enough when you need them to get the tonality of certain notes. Whereas if you put those effects on in tracking, they're going to play the way they should. And whilst it is more subtle when recording with hardware on, say, vocals or drums or bass or whatever, it is still the same concept. The hardware, the preamps and the compressors and EQs that you track through add compression and saturation, and the artist performs into those effects. So what results is you get a much different performance in the end. You get a performance that is responding to what the artist is hearing in their headphones running through those effects. And it's not the same as recording clean and then adding those plugins for compression and EQ later on. And this is the huge misconception that people miss about tracking through hardware versus plugins. There is a benefit to it. There's a trade-off, yes, there's a massive trade-off because there's a risk in compressing or over-compressing or over-EQing on the way in. But if you do it right, the trade-off is non-existent for me. Like I feel like there's never a risk anymore with me tracking through compression and EQ with almost any source of music in the styles that I record and produce here in my studio. Now, the last point I want to make that people miss about recording with hardware on the way in during tracking is that you can still EQ and compress in post later on with plugins or with more hardware if that's what you want to do. It's actually not that big a deal. What you might find is what I've learned over the years, when you track through hardware, you actually can still mix later on with more compression and more EQ. And in fact, you can use plugins better sometimes because you don't have to push them as hard because the tracks have already been processed somewhat and the heavy lifting has been done potentially by the hardware. And then you can apply gently some plug-in EQ and compression later on. And I find that that works better and you often get better results. And the crazy thing on top of that is you could still use more hardware compression and stuff as parallel or even on the tracks themselves. You can still further compress and EQ a vocal in post even after compressing and EQing on the way in if you need to. And this is the way records have been made for decades. And some of your favorite records were done exactly this way. There's a reason why top mix engineers get amazing sounding records from the get-go and they can go, oh, all I had to do was push up faders and it sounded good. And that's because the tracking engineers used hardware on the way in. Compression, EQ, they cleaned up those tracks, they dialed in the tones on the tracking day, and then that results in a much better mix. So I feel like this argument for tracking completely clean with no processing kind of misses the point, especially with regards to modern rock, pop, hip hop, R&B, metal, and all those kind of contemporary genres. Now there's one more point that I need to make about why you should track using hardware. And I've kind of already touched on this already. It's that, say I start with drums and I add a bit of processing on the way in. Then I need to track bass immediately after that when I have a band in the studio. I can make the right choices to how that bass should sound because my drums have already been cleaned up and compressed and I can hear the space that's left to fill for those guitar parts. And the same goes for the electric guitars and the vocals. As I track, I try and clean up with EQ as much of the low frequency stuff I need to get rid of, or the high frequencies or low mids out of each and every track as I go. And I compress them as I go as well. And like, I'm not doing like crazy moves in tracking. I'm doing the moves that I know that are safe and that are gonna help with the mix. And what this allows me to do is during tracking, hear the space that's left over for the vocals, for the guitars, and how I should then track those parts as overdubs. And so that is like a twofold benefit. One, I make better recording choices, but then two, when I get to mixing, I have far less work to do because I've made those choices and committed ideas in the tracking phase. And some people might find this daunting, like, why should I make these choices in tracking when I can make them later on? I totally see that, and I've been in that position as well. But if you make the right choices during tracking, you'll get better tracking results because you're creating the right spaces for each of those instruments as you go, rather than just recording heaps and heaps of junk that you don't need. Anyway, it's a complex thing. Everyone has their own workflow and everyone has their own reasons for deciding the way they track. And whilst I disagree pretty strongly with the comments made in regard to using hardware during tracking in their video, I can also see the point that they're trying to get to, that you can, fully mix using plugins, and there's a benefit to that. There's certain genres where you do not want to overproduce and maybe don't want to add any compression at all during the tracking phase. But what I'm trying to say to you guys is don't be scared to use hardware during tracking, because it can actually be a really beneficial tool for you as an engineer and also better for your artists. And if you are concerned about using compression and EQ on the way in during tracking, there's a much better solution to this, especially when it comes to things like vocals or simple guitar or bass setups. You can literally just split the signals. One dry, one wet, one with the processing that you're doing, and then one without the processing. And if you split that using a splitter, or there's other methods you could do, that way you're getting both signals, and if you make a mistake, you can process with plugins later on. And I would say, especially for vocals and simple recording setups, that's probably the best way to go if you're unsure. Might be a bit trickier to do with drums, I fully understand that, but try it out, see how you go. But don't be scared of using hardware. Most of your favorite records that were ever made were tracked using vintage hardware gear, and that's for a reason, because it sounds good. But that's just my opinion. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comment sections down below. I'm keen to know, do you think it's great to use hardware during tracking? Do you prefer to track completely clean? Do you do something that's a bit more hybrid? Let me know. I'm super interested to know what you guys think and how you're tracking on your own sessions. And remember, keep it friendly down in the comment sections down below. I'm not making this video to rip on anyone's idea of how the right way is to track. I don't think there is a right and a wrong way to track. It's all up to you. And also remember that plugins, hardware, these are all just tools that we have at our disposal to use how we want. It's up to you how you want to track and record or mix or master. Anyway, as always, hopefully this video was helpful to you guys. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I'm Mitch from the DIYRecordingstudio.com. I'll catch you soon.